things the same now, and he will give a presentation on a new gas to liquids technology, which is developed at Texas A&M.
Well, in the interest of truth in advertising, I must tell you this is not a Fischer-Tropsch talk. In fact, this process has nothing to do with Fischer-Tropsch, and I have a great deal of difficulty convincing people of that. However, it is a new type of process that we came up with at Texas A&M. And the way I like to describe it is that anyone who knows what they're doing and wants to convert gas to liquid, of course, uses Fischer-Tropsch. We did not know what we were doing, and so we found something different. It actually started out as a vastly different project. It was going to be a waste destruction project. It was going to use plasmas. It was going to use fuel cells. It had all the buzzwords in it. The only problem is that economics reared its ugly head and said you can't do it that way. And so we decided we did not have a waste destruction process. And I was talking to a colleague and he says, well, could you convert natural gas into ethylene using your idea? And I said, sure. And then I went to check to see if I could, and I could not. But I could turn it into acetylene, and of course it's pretty easy to turn acetylene into ethylene. So what I'm going to describe today is this new process in which we can produce liquids or ethylene, depending upon your location and your desires. This is a schematic of the process, and it's a little bit complicated because it obviously has recycle in it, but let's start with the natural gas coming in, and we have an air separation plant. Nothing in the process requires pure oxygen. However, if we put air in, then we'll quadruple or quintuple the size of our downstream units, and the plant will cost much more. So it's just better to stick in the air plant and save the money downstream. We also bring air into the air plant. The reason I show the natural gas going in there is that the worst acting component of natural gas, of course, is nitrogen. It's the hardest thing to get out. And I rather hope that we might utilize the air separation plant to reject the nitrogen from the natural gas as well as the air. And what we would come out with is natural gas without nitrogen. We're going to add recycle, which I'll discuss later, and go to what I call a burner cracker quench here. This is going to be a thermal cracking process. We're going to utilize very high temperatures and crack the methane and all of the other hydrocarbons in the fuel. Basically what happens is that we have a burner up here, and it's an internal combustion burner. We may use as much as 10% of the natural gas to get all of the energy required. If we're going the liquid route, we will have hydrogen that we'll be recycling that we can use as a fuel. The temperatures in this process are somewhere on the order of 2,000 to 2,500 Kelvin. And the pressure is anywhere from atmospheric to approximately 3 bar. We then inject the natural gas somewhere below the burner so that the flue gas from the burner can actually crack the natural gas. And what we achieve here is about 42 to 45% single pass conversion of hydrocarbons to acetylene. Of course, acetylene is the only hydrocarbon that's stable at these temperatures. We'll also have a considerable amount of hydrogen coming out here, and acetylene, some carbon oxides, and any nitrogen that we didn't get rid of. We have a spray tower here that's primary purpose is to cool the gas. The quench will cool the gas cold enough to stop the reaction, but it doesn't cool the gas sufficiently to process it further. The spray tower will cool the gas down to something on the order of 50 to 60 Celsius. Spray tower can also knock out any carbon or coke that happens to carry along. However, there's not much coke produced in this process. In the cracker up here, we detect less than 2% coke production. We then compress the gas up perhaps to something on the order of 20 bar and go into a hydrogenation reactor. The reason we do this, of course, is that if we could use acetylene throughout the process. If we did, we'd probably make almost all benzene, assuming that it didn't decide to explode at some point during the process. So we convert it into ethylene. There are two routes to go here. One is the traditional route using the mobile catalyst, in which we get essentially 100% of the acetylene converted to ethylene. The other route is the route we decided to go. We seem to do everything wrong. But the reason we went the other route is that we perform a liquid phase hydrogenation. And there we get somewhere between 96 and 98% conversion of the acetylene to ethylene. Why did we choose to do the liquid phase conversion? Because, again, we can reduce the downstream equipment size enormously if we go with this liquid phase conversion. This is the only thing in the process that's completely proprietary. Everything else in the process was something that was off the shelf. The only thing is that this thing up here was off the shelf approximately 40 years ago. And it's just a standard natural gas to acetylene conversion unit, such as Hughes or Hicks or many other companies had back in the days before World War II. At any point, at this point right here, we have a decision to make, because we now have a stream that's a lot of hydrogen and a considerable amount of ethylene, some unreacted methane, and some carbon oxides. The carbon oxides are pretty easy to get out, but we could just take it over to a separation unit and produce ethylene and possibly produce hydrogen. If we don't produce hydrogen, we can recycle it with the methane and carbon oxides back into the burner. We'd probably remove the carbon dioxide before we went into the burner, but any carbon monoxide in the stream can go on and be part of the fuel in the burner. If we choose to go the liquid route, then we also come to a separation unit. But in this case, we're separating the hydrogen and water from the hydrocarbons. And the hydrogen and water can recycle, as I said. Putting the water in with the burner part up here, of course, reduces the coke formation. The hydrogen we would actually use as fuel in this case in the burner, reducing the need for natural gas as fuel. You might say, why not just use this methane as the fuel, the recycle? That's because it would be better to crack it. This process would work better with pure methane than it does with natural gas. And the reason is that if you put natural gas in here at this, to the burner, it will, of course, all the C2+ will crack very easily, and it will suck energy out of the process, leaving less energy and a lower temperature to crack the methane. So it would actually be better to have some sort of demethanizer to put the methane in first, and then let the hot acetylene and the rest of the flue gases crack the C2+, which is relatively simple to do. We have a catalytic reactor here, just a solid acid catalyst, again an off-the-shelf catalyst. I think we finally ended up doping it a little bit with some stuff, but it really didn't matter. And it would produce a stream that I'm going to show you a composition of shortly here. We go into product separation and pull the liquid off, and then recycle light gases back to the burner. The product is essentially an aviation gasoline if we operate this process at low pressure. If we operate the process at high pressure, then we would probably produce essentially the same sort of things Fischer-Tropsch does. Gasolines, diesels, and waxes. Just real quick, what the chemistry does is that a couple of methanes go to ethane and hydrogen, which instantly goes to ethylene and hydrogen, which instantly goes to acetylene and hydrogen. These reactions occur in the order of microseconds. Then luckily the acetylene going to carbon takes milliseconds. And in fact, we leave the reaction, or we allow the reaction to occur over a period of somewhere between 2 to 5 milliseconds in the cracker. This, of course, also reduces cooling. An unwanted reaction, of course, would be that acetylene and steam would produce carbon monoxide and hydrogen. But luckily, this reaction occurs at about the same rate as this reaction, and so when we quench here, we also quench here. Incidentally, kind of interesting that in this process, we do not want syngas. It gets in the way. This is a typical composition at that point in the process that I described earlier. And you can see that there are light gases reconstituted, and let's call them light down through I'll say hexanes. You notice also there's very little benzene produced. But there is quite a bit of aromatics. The ethylbenzenes, toluenes, nonane aromatics, xylenes. In fact, about 1/2 of this, if you take away the light gases and recycle them, that's about 50%. The rest of it is about 50% aromatics. But the remaining is about 30, the remaining 50% is 60% isoalkanes and 40% cycloalkanes. There are some straight chain hydrocarbons in there, but very few compared to the iso and cyclones. The fuel itself, of course, would then start somewhere around here and be this part. It's a 95 octane C8 average, and as I said, it's basically an aviation gasoline. It would be very easy to reduce this down to an automobile gasoline by removing some of the aromatics and sending them off as feedstock to a chemical plant. Of course, if I had my way, being a chemical engineer, I would take all of the aromatics away and send it to a chemical plant, and then use the isoalkanes and cycloalkanes as a 100 octane C8 alkylation stock for gasoline. We built a pilot plant, and this is it. And this pilot plant is about 25 meters square. This man right here is 2 meters tall. This is a failed attempt at a cracker. It was an electric heater. Looked like a great idea at the time. It worked, but it would only work for about 24 to 36 hours before something would happen to it. So it's now holding down some grass out in the field near this plant. And we replaced it with our own design first, and then ultimately with one of the pre-World War II acetylene reactors. This process is obviously spread out a great deal because when we built the pilot plant, we did not know for sure what we were going to be doing. And we assumed that we would repipe a lot of it, and sure enough we did. This, for instance, right here is a hydrogen compressor. And as it turns out, its primary function was to hold down that part of the floor. We just did not need the hydrogen compressor. This is the spray tower. It's by far the largest unit in the pilot plant. The compressor is behind it, the chromatograph to check what's going on, the hydrogenation unit if we were using gas phase. This is a glycol and amine unit to remove water and carbon dioxide. Turns out we did not need to remove the water. This is the reactor we put up in the pilot plant. It's approximately, I'm trying to do the conversions, about 40 centimeters in diameter and about 5 meters tall. And the stabilization unit is over here, and this is membrane separation for the hydrogen and water. It's spread out because we were also afraid that we didn't know exactly what the process would do. And so this does not really look like a typical chemical plant. Nominally, this is 100,000 standard cubic feet per day for the pilot plant. However, now we've changed it over to a demonstration plant, and it looks like this. You can still see the spray tower sitting there. The cracker is this little thing right here, and it's right now it's about this big around and about that tall. And it would handle 100,000 standard cubic feet a day easily. Some preconditioning heaters. The compressor is still back there. The liquid phase hydrogenation unit is over here. And interestingly enough, the catalytic reactor is now 15 centimeters in diameter and 2 meters tall. And it's completely sufficient to handle 100,000 standard cubic feet a day. Another picture of the hydrogenation unit. It turned out to be the biggest thing in the plant. And I said I was going to save downstream size. Well, it saves more money downstream than it costs to put in this much larger hydrogenation unit. And then just another view of the process. At this point, it takes about 15 meters by 15 meters for the 100,000 a day. Well, what are the, let's see, I should say the rest of it. The catalytic reactor also produces very little coke. We think that overall the entire process produces less than 5% coke. Of course, if you go the ethylene route, you're probably down around 2% coke. What are the economics of the process? Well, have to go to some kind of a standard description. And the standard description that most Fischer-Tropsch processes use is that they're working with a remote gas that is produced at 50 cents a thousand. So I'll give you numbers based upon 50 cents a million BTU as the production cost of remote gas. Straight line 10-year amortization of capital investment. The Fischer-Tropsch processes usually put $1 to $3 a barrel as fixed and operating costs. We put 30%, which is probably closer to $10 a barrel. If you add all that up, and if you operate on a 10 to 25 million standard cubic feet a day plant, then the price comes out at $25 a barrel for liquids. Now, of course, you cannot build Fischer-Tropsch plants economically at that level. But at today's prices, it appears we could go down to 5 million standard cubic feet a day with one of these plants and be profitable. In fact, the liquid would probably cost, at 5 million a day, it would be close to $30 a barrel, but somewhat less. If we get up to Fischer-Tropsch size plants, hundreds of millions of standard cubic feet a day, we can drop considerably below $20 a barrel on this admittedly very simple economic scheme. Of course, I've not charged cost of capital, and I've not charged transportation because that's going to vary wherever you put the plant. But that's the same basis that as we understand it, the people that do Fischer-Tropsch make their economic comparisons. And so it's a fair comparison. How much liquid do we get out? About the same as Fischer-Tropsch. Well, no, that's not exactly true because we get all aviation gasoline out. We do not produce diesel, we do not produce wax, and so it comes out essentially all liquid, but it's a relatively light liquid. So you get about the standard 10,000 cubic feet of gas per barrel of liquid. Thermal efficiency, obviously, it's still going to be about 74% because you must remove hydrogen or you cannot turn the gas into liquid. And when you remove the hydrogen, you remove essentially 25% of the heating value of the gas. Carbon efficiency, well, I said we have about 5% coke, and we could use as much as 10% of the gas as fuel. So we ought to be running somewhere in the 80 to 85% range on carbon efficiency. we had an independent, or the company that licensed the process had an independent contracting company produce a design for a 50 million a day plant and estimate the cost. And they estimated the cost at installed at something on the order of $120 million. So that's the story of the new process, and I'd be happy to answer any questions you might have about it.
Can you catalyst tolerate the high concentration of carbon monoxide, or you have to separate it before the liquid phase?
The catalyst would not be affected at all by carbon monoxide, but there's very little in the process. And let's see, if we go the liquid route, there would be a very small fraction of carbon monoxide in the process. The catalyst would also tolerate hydrogen sulfide, but of course you would obviously want to remove the hydrogen sulfide because it goes sour in, you get sour out.
Yes, please.
In the ethylene mode, what would be the selectivity of ethylene in terms of carbon and the methane? What would be then the selectivity for ethylene? 10%, 20% in terms of carbon of the methane to be found in the ethylene finally.
I'm trying to get to that. We get about 45% conversion of the carbon to acetylene and about 96% of the acetylene to ethylene in single pass. And remove and recycle.
And at the end of the total, with a simple calculation, that's the product, there's the methane, percentage only.
Okay, then it would be, you mean of carbon in?
Yeah. Carbon and the methane, and the carbon, the ethylene, selectivity percentage of ethylene.
Yeah, the percentage would be essentially 80 to 85%.
Really?
Because you only have about 5% coke, and about 10% of the natural gas goes into fuel. And the rest of the carbon finally comes out as ethylene.
Because when I remember the acetylene processes, normally the acetylene, the concentration is not that high, and if it's now being hydrogenated with ethylene, I wonder what of such a high percentage in selectivity.
So we get about 96 to 98% of the acetylene going to ethylene in the liquid phase. If we went gas phase, we'd get 100%. We tested that.
You said that you didn't need a air separation unit. What would happen if you put the nitrogen through that temperature in that redox environment? What would it go to?
You would probably get some nitrogen oxides, but the worst factor would be that you would have nitrogen left over and the downstream equipment would grow in size enormously.
In the liquid hydrogenation, I'd like to ask two questions. What is the maximum acetylene tolerance at the entrance of the hydrogen liquid hydrogenation? And second one is stability of the catalyst. Did we try for long-term stability?
In the liquid phase, we can tolerate a very large fraction of acetylene. I believe we're running at this particular one at something on the order of 20%. No, it's just, we don't know what the maximum is because we haven't taken it up there to see when it will blow up. But we have been running it at 20%, and that certainly seems to be tolerable. And the catalyst, it is reasonably stable. It requires